Right, we've had a big hour talking about, really on the back of the news that Tom Robinson has been signed by Steve Hansen's Toyota Verblitz, and is this a marker of we've seen marquee players go to Japan. Now we're starting to see second-tier play. There's a lot of Kiwis over there, and a man that knows rugby as well as anyone in the world is former CEO of, well, New Zealand Rugby, the NRL, Wales, England Sport, the whole shebang, very well credentialed, David Moffett, and he joins the show. G'day, David.
G'day, Staffy. My first time on SENZ. Looking forward to it.
Yeah, me too, mate. Me too. Very much so. It was. I wouldn't say New Zealand was hit with shockwaves with Tom Robinson, but it wasn't met famously. Like, no one's pointing the finger at Tom for going. He's 29. He's had his injury and concussion issues, and he's off to Japan to make some coin. I was just wondering, in your learned mind, the strategy of Japanese club rugby and the Japanese rugby union with overseas players. We've seen the likes of Dan Carter, Bowden Barrett, Brodie Retallick, Martin Onu a few years ago, marquee signings. Is that, I get the feeling that's changing.
It is. It's changing quite dramatically, actually. I have quite a lot to do with Robbie Deans, and who's up there coaching Saitama Wild Knights, and once again, they're doing very well. They're 13 a day. And you can only have 3 former test players playing in your squad, and you can only have 4 overseas players playing in your bigger squad for any game. But there are some teams that are stacking their overall squad with a lot more overseas players. And a lot of overseas players that are not at the back end of their career, the players that you mentioned earlier. And the reason for that is that Japan's decided they want players to go and play in Japan who are committed to Japanese rugby. Maybe not to play for the Japanese national team, but quite often that does happen. But the game there has changed as well. It's no longer an easy ride up in Japan. I mean, if you were to speak to players that have been up there recently and come back, it's tough. It's become a really tough competition, and with that comes the need to have players of quality and players that have got quite a few years left in them, and that's why you're seeing the guys like Tom Robinson go up there.
Yeah, because I felt like when it started happening with these marquees and New Zealand Rugby labelled it sabbatical, and players were getting $1 million for a shortened season, etc., and they'd come back to New Zealand and they were off the boil for a while. If I was Japanese rugby, I would do exactly what you're intimating they are going to be doing. And I mentioned players, non-All Blacks, haven't made the All Blacks, haven't made squads yet, but good young players like Cam Roigard, like Ruben Love, like George Bell, these types of guys who are early 20s, they'd be attractive to Japanese clubs. But what is Japanese rugby goal with these guys? Is it to make Japanese international players? Because I know they probably would rather Japanese nationals play for their national team rather than imports that do a 3-year naturalisation process. What do you think the squads will look like in the coming years?
Oh, I think they'll have some non-Japanese players in them. Will continue to do so. I mean, and it's not just New Zealand players that are going up there. You may remember Cornelsen, who scored 4 tries against the All Blacks at Eden Park. His son is up there playing Saitama Wild Knights, and he's chosen to go and play there. And I'm pretty sure he's in the Japanese national team, or if he's not, he's very close to making it. And so they are looking for players who are going to commit to Japan. And they, of course, will want to bring on Japanese players. I mean, Robbie Deans has had a lot of success by actually bringing on Japanese players, and they stand at the top of the table. And he's got a slightly different philosophy, and that is that you can coach Japanese players to be really good rugby players, but you also need an influx of players that have been brought up in, let's say, New Zealand, South Africa, or Australia. Not too many Northern Hemisphere players end up in Japan, but I think that's about to change as well. I've noticed that a couple of Welsh players are going there. Welsh rugby's in such a dire strait at the moment. And so, Japan rugby is a real force to be reckoned with, actually, in the professional game.
I opened the show, David. We're talking to David Moffett at the moment about Steve Hansen's reaction when he was All Black coach. His reaction when Brad Shields left, Charles Piutau left, Stephen Luatua left, and to paraphrase all of his quotes around, he was really disappointed that they turned their back onto New Zealand rugby, and he was particularly disappointed with the Stephen Luatua one because he went to Pat Lam, and Pat Lam's a former New Zealander, and he thought that was a little bit disingenuous, but now we find Steve Hansen doing exactly the same thing.
Needs must, mate. I mean, Toyota are not travelling that well at the moment. They're mid-table and likely to miss out on the playoffs. So, they are results oriented up there just as well as anywhere else in professional sport. So he's obviously looking at trying to bolster his squad. It's a different attitude to the one that Robbie Deans takes, where he's much more concentrating on bringing through Japanese players and having a lot of success. But other teams are also having a success, and I think we'll see more of it. And it's a professional sport, so whilst I think it's one thing to point the finger at Hansen and say, well, this is what you said and this is what you're doing now. Well, he's moved on. And the reality is that results count. And, I think we've seen that with Fozzie, although he was treated terribly by New Zealand rugby. End of the day, though, it's results that count.
Should New Zealand rugby fans be concerned? We've had a few texts and calls into the show saying we've got depth. If players want to go, they can go and we'll fill it. Can that keep going? Is there a concern? Is this good for New Zealand rugby, what's happening at the moment?
No, it's not good because it affects every tier of New Zealand rugby, from clubs all the way up. And we have a look now, for example, the All Blacks never play NPC, and that's degraded the NPC. They never play, well, they play obviously in Super Rugby, but a lot of them, they start late in Super Rugby. And if those play, now that's my biggest concern, is that the more that players go, it's not so much the All Blacks, but it's those players that are playing Super Rugby. And the more of those players that go, the more it's going to affect Super Rugby. And I don't think we have a conveyor belt any longer to the extent that we used to in the past. Because of a variety of reasons. But, it is a concern. When we started Super Rugby back in 1995, 96, and I was at the very beginning of all of that, we actually used to have conversations about how could we not affect club rugby as much with Super Rugby. And, of course, that changed. I went to 18 teams. I went to, playing over an extended period of time. So club rugby completely got washed away by Super Rugby. And that's pretty much happened with the NPC. Now, the NPC, for example, in Australia, the NPC, they're very envious of it because what it does is it brings the players up through another level. And if all these players are going to be going, that is the area. And there's one other thing, too, that I'd like to mention, and that is the drain of coaches. The number of coaches coaching overseas who could actually be in the All Black coaching frame, in future years, is massive, and you can't lose all those good coaches. I mean, the last, Razor's just been appointed, and I've always thought that was a good idea to appoint him. But outside of that, you only had Jamie Joseph was the only other applicant. All the others are overseas, or they didn't want to coach for whatever reason. The All Blacks. So, the question is, if Razor and Jamie Joseph weren't in the frame, where are the other coaches coming through in New Zealand? They're all overseas, a lot of these good young coaches. And they're going over there because they don't really see, they can get a lot more money over there. Just the same as the players. I'm sure that, players are going to Japan for the money, and it's a great experience, but the money that they're offering will be the major attraction.
How do we keep the coaches in New Zealand, given that we've got an All Black coach and his assistants, and we've got 5 super teams, and all of the NPC teams, and there's coaches all around the world, as you say, New Zealanders that would be amazing back at NPC level. Is it finances? We just haven't got the money to afford to keep them here?
Yep, absolutely. That's what professional sport is all about. It's about money. It's really not about anything else, you know. And when players leave, and you've just seen Sue Ali go from, you know, only having been in the NRL for 2 years, signing with Rugby Australia for $4.8 million. I mean, you know, it's money. It's just money. It's got nothing to do with, you know, the love of the game, no matter what they might say. And you don't blame them because it's a professional sport. Nobody knows how long their career is likely to be. So, you know, they've got to go for the money. And the money is big in Europe and it's big in Japan. You know, if it comes to an all-out fight, then we're not going to do very well. The great thing still about New Zealand is the black jersey. You know, so many kids want to be able to pull that on. And, you know, and when they get it, you know, they most likely sleep in it the very first night they get awarded their black jersey. I don't know how long that's able to last in this new world of consumerism.
Is there too much rugby, David? Like in a small country like New Zealand, we have school, club, heartland, NPC, super, international. It's a lot of levels.
It is, but it is what has actually stood New Zealand in really good stead in identifying and bringing through new talent. Professional rugby players are not born. You know, they don't just turn up one day and say, here I am, I want to be. They're made. And where are they made? They're made in the junior clubs. They're made in the senior clubs. They're made in coming through the NPC. Some of them, you know, who go into academies, I think, unfortunately, miss out on that. You know, I think there's some players have never, ever played for a club. Certainly that would be the case in Australia, talking to Robbie this morning. And he, you know, and he thinks that they miss out on that real grassroots approach to everything. And I think that's an unintended consequence of professional rugby, where a lot of these players, young players, they go into an academy, they don't play very much, they get given everything, they don't really have to fight for anything. And they would most likely do them good to go back to club rugby and play some really good, hard club rugby. And I think that's why club rugby is so important. All the levels of rugby in New Zealand are what we give us that edge. And unfortunately, we're losing so many players to overseas. I think that we're starting to miss that.
So what do we have to turn around, David? Like attendances are down at Super Rugby. There were 4 games in New Zealand last weekend, and more people went to the Dolphins-Broncos game in Brisbane than all 4 Super Rugby games in New Zealand here, and it is our number one sport. NPC numbers are dwindling as well. Viewership numbers are dwindling. We're losing players overseas. You've already highlighted the coaches overseas. So much intellectual property over there. Do we have to central or just narrow the field? Do we need less teams? Do we need to do something really radical?
Well, I don't think any of the rugby unions around the world are into radical. You know, that's a problem. You know, I mean, my understanding is that basketball is now a bigger participation sport than rugby in New Zealand.
It is.
And when I tell people that from overseas, they're flabbergasted that could have happened, but it has happened. And for a whole lot of reasons. The game at the moment, the way it's played in most countries, not New Zealand, but most countries, is atrocious to watch. I wouldn't like to play it, and I certainly wouldn't like to referee it as a former referee. And what rugby has forgotten is, especially at the professional level, what business are they in? They're not in rugby. They're in the entertainment business. And the entertainment has gone out of rugby. So people are saying, I'm not going to go and watch that again, bash, kick, bash, kick, bash, kick. It's like unlimited rugby league, you know, unlimited tackle rugby league, whereas it used to be in the 60s. So, you know, people want to be entertained. They've got a very short, you know, attention span. And that is one of the things that I think where New Zealand is missing out. We never hear from the chief executive. That he never comes out and tells us, you know, what the plans are, what they're doing, what his vision is for the future. Nobody knows. And people are being turned off by that. And so, you know, there's some fundamental issues that have got to be addressed. They're not easy to address, by the way. because times they have been a-changing for a long time. But if you don't understand that you're in the entertainment industry and you'd better start entertaining people, then you'll lose them.
Yeah, it's interesting. You touched on Mark Robinson, CEO of New Zealand Rugby. In your, if you had the CEO hat on now, or even back then, what was your approach to communication with media, with public, etc.?
Well, if you rang me up for an interview, I'd do it straight away because I loved it, you know. And I guess that's why radio stations like yourselves and others, you know, get me on, because what they'll know, I'll have something to say. It might or might not be interesting, but I'll at least have something to say. I'm available to have something to say, and I'm passionate about New Zealand rugby. And I will, you know, and I will speak truthfully. And that's really what you guys want in the media. You don't want all these, you know, I've got 3 must-says and I'm never going to get off those, and those must-says are going to be really nothing. You know, you're in the entertainment business. Rugby's in the entertainment business, but they don't seem, and this Robinson guy doesn't seem to understand that. He's got to get out there and communicate with the fans. Otherwise, they'll go, you know, what the hell? I mean, the number of people I speak to now who say, well, they just can't be bothered, you know, and that is a very quick, massive change. When you take the 2019 Rugby World Cup result, nobody cared, you know, really nobody cared. Oh yeah, so, you know, we lost. Well, so what? Whereas, you know, just a few years before that, you know, all hell would break loose. How dare we lose, et cetera, et cetera. But that's gone.
It's interesting you mentioned that, actually, because if I can get the CEO of the Warriors in 10 minutes, I can get CEO of New Zealand basketball, biggest participation sport, I can get him in 5 minutes. But Mark Robinson 2 weeks ago said he'd come on with me 2 weeks after Scott Robertson, or after the next All Black coach was named, told me a couple of things that might be happening in June, but not ready to announce it yet. And I said, why don't you tell people what you're thinking? What are you working towards, this global rugby calendar that apparently there's a meeting in June and they feel like it might get across the line, even though it's been talked about for 100 years. Why don't you take us on that journey? Oh, it's too early to talk about it. But I feel like there's a lack of involvement from the top with media, because the media is the only way that people that were in your position, are in Mark Robinson's position, can talk to the public.
Absolutely. And how many sports get an opportunity to actually get on to your show and other shows free of charge, right? And tell everybody about their sport. I mean, there would be sports out there who would pay to be able to do that. Yet with rugby, I mean, Rugby League, for example, in Sydney, the back 10 pages of the Daily Telegraph are Rugby League. You know, that's an incredible amount of free advertising that you get. And you guys, you know, if you go on your show, that's free advertising. So why wouldn't you go? Honestly, I get so frustrated. You know, if you don't like doing media, or you can't because you're incompetent or whatever it is, get somebody on there who can. Get somebody on there who can give you a story, which you then actually let all of the fans know. And but they won't do it. You know, they seem to think that it's, we've got to keep everything secret, and, you know, why should we tell the fans what's going on? Well, the fans pay their wages. Whichever way you look at it, the fans are the most important thing that you've got, because they either subscribe to Sky or to your show or to other shows, or they buy newspapers or all that sort of stuff. The fans are keeping this sport alive, and yet they treat the fans in New Zealand with disdain.
Bang on. And it's like, when I have had the opportunity a couple of times to talk to someone, and I said, you know, the fans, they're saying this, the public is saying this, and they said, look, the fans, they're passionate and we really like that, but, you know, we know what we're doing. And so they dismiss the fans' passion as misguided, but it's not. It's the foundation of the game.
It is, absolutely. Just like, you know, juniors and club rugby is the foundation of the game. It all builds from there. And if you haven't got a strong base, you haven't got a strong top, you know, and they don't seem to understand that. And it's very, very disappointing, to be perfectly honest with you. to see what's happening. There's, as you said in your show, there's a great debate about whether New Zealand rugby is going to be able to hold the line of you've got to play in New Zealand to play for New Zealand. Now, I've always been an advocate for that, right from the very first time that we went professional. We put that in place. But even now, that's relaxed when these players go offshore for their sabbaticals. They go over there and then they come back. I mean, Matt Todd was an example where, he was playing. I think he was playing for Robbie Dean's team. New Zealand went through there on their way to Europe, and they needed Matt Todd, and so they actually put him in the team, and off they went. So it's happened before, when needs must, and I worry because it's happened in Australia. And it's happened in South Africa to a much greater extent than anywhere else. And I just don't think that it's feasible that they're going to be able to hang on forever to the allure of the black jersey, which is huge. Don't get me wrong. I'm in awe of the All Blacks, always have been. But whether that's going to be enough of a draw when you're looking at huge financial differences, I don't know.
David, we're out of time. I could talk to you all day, so we're definitely going to keep your number and we'll stay in touch. I really appreciate your input today.
Okay, mate. Thank you. Thanks for having me on.